ladies and gentlemen, we're off to see the wizard, Dr. Zac Fitz-Walter. Good morning.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Zac. I've come all the way from Australia to be here, which is nice. Which, I know, it's a long way, isn't it? I've actually been traveling around Europe a little bit before, so it wasn't the whole trip to get here. But I just found out today that it is 43 degrees in one of the parts of Australia, so it's quite hot. So it's nice to be here in the cool weather. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak, and also for organizing such a great conference with so many interesting people in the world of gamification, including yourselves. So let's get into it. Before we begin, I guess a little bit about myself. So my name is Zac. I did get one of the first PhDs in the world in gamification, which was great. Back when I started, gamification wasn't really called gamification. I was calling it pervasive, persuasive design, which doesn't sound as good as gamification, doesn't roll off the tongue as easily. But my focus was on mobile apps and designing effective gamification using motivational psychology, particularly looking at mobile apps. I then moved on to become a lecturer at the same university, so Queensland University of Technology, where I taught game design, user experience, and developed one of the first subjects for gamification as well. And then I quit academia and went into the industry. I figured I must practice what I preach. And so I became a gamification consultant, speaker, and I also run a company called Eat More Pixels, and we develop apps and games. So that's a little bit about me. But of course, that's all interesting, but probably my biggest achievement is that I've been training for 25 years for this moment. That's right, I've had 25 years of experience playing games. Mum managed to find this photo of me, and she's like, yes, you were a nerd back then, and you are a nerd now. But yeah, 25 years of experience playing games. So, learning a lot, training to become a gamification designer today. The reason was I just found games to be very engaging. I couldn't put it down. I used to wake up early in the morning, get up at 5 a.m., play games before everyone else got up, and then would go to school, come back and play games. But the interesting thing is it's not just me who finds games engaging. In fact, a lot of people, I'd say probably in this room, and also in the world, find games to be very engaging. There's a recent report that came out from the ESA 2018, came out about 2 weeks ago, this is the Entertainment Software Association of America. And in it, they had an interesting statistic, and that is that 60% of Americans play video games daily. Now, just think about that for a second. That's a lot. That's over half of people in America. They pick up and they play a game on a daily basis. So it's not just me who finds games engaging. There's a lot of other people out there as well. What I find most interesting, though, is that some games are really engaging. So take, for example, World of Warcraft. You may have heard of World of Warcraft, you may have not. It was first released in 2004. It's what's known as an MMORPG, or a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Again, doesn't run off the tongue that easily, does it? But the interesting thing about this game is that it has engaged people and still continues to engage people 14 years after it was released. Now, there was an analyst that crunched some numbers and estimated how much time we've actually spent in this one game alone. And as of 2012, when the article came out, they estimated that players had spent 50 billion hours of game time in this one game alone. That's roughly about 6 million years, which is the same time that we have spent evolving as a species. So that is a lot of time being spent in just one game. And also imagine if we spent that time elsewhere, curing cancer or something like that. So what's really interesting is that, some games in particular can engage us very well. So the idea goes, I guess, if games can be so engaging, maybe we could look at applying some of the things that we can learn from games or game design elements or process, etc., to other areas. Wouldn't that be neat if we could do that? Well, luckily for us, there's an industry that exists, and it's the reason why we're here today, called gamification. And so there is this industry that's developed now looking at exactly this, looking at how we can apply best practices from games, game design elements, methods, processes, and look at the root of games, why they're engaging in the first place. So looking at psychology, motivational psychology, and apply that to other areas to make them more engaging. What What's interesting, though, is we often focus on the successes of both games and gamification, but we don't often talk enough about the failures as well. And I think this is something really interesting to focus on, because for every good game out there, there's probably just as many bad or even more bad games out there as well. And we tend to focus on the success stories like World of Warcraft, but we don't look at all the other games that have failed. And these games are interesting because people have spent a lot of time and money. They've invested a lot into creating these games, and when they fail, it's not the best outcome for everyone involved. We also generally tend to focus on the success stories in terms of overnight successes, or what we think of are overnight successes. And we don't look at the fact that success often doesn't come overnight. There's a lot of hard work that goes into creating a good game and a good gamification design as well. So, for example, take this game. Have you heard of this game? Yeah? Angry something, birds, I don't know. Angry Birds, I'm sure you've all heard of it. But the company that created it, Rovio, how many games do you think they made before Angry Birds? Yeah, 51, exactly. So there was 51 games. So they weren't a brand new company. They just didn't create Angry Birds overnight, release it, and make millions. They'd created 51 games before this game. And in the 2 months leading up to deciding whether they were going to go with Angry Birds or not, they had pitched hundreds of ideas before then deciding to choose the game about slingshotting Angry Birds into pigs to knock them over. So it's easy to focus on the success stories, but not on the work that goes into creating these success stories. With this in mind, it's difficult to create a good game. It's also very difficult to design a good gamified system as well. What's interesting is that all of this applies, and I'd say it's even more difficult to a certain extent because we're not just creating or trying to create a fun experience, we're also looking at changing people's behavior or motivating them to do things as well. Luckily for us, the games design industry has been around for a while, it's well established, and there are a lot of interesting techniques that we can take from this industry and apply to the gamification design industry as well. The three that I want to talk about in particular today are these three. So iterative design, prototyping, and playtesting. These are three very useful game design techniques, and not even just game design techniques. We see them out in the real world for other projects too. So being used to create systems, computers, websites, applications, etc. But these three are worth talking about, particularly from a game design perspective, because some of the things that we do in the area of game design can be applied to gamification design as well. So iterative design, let's start with that. Iterative design is the process of basically designing something with a number of iterations or a number of design loops. So the design loops may look something like this. It's where we have an idea for something, and once we've justified the idea, so we've gone through the research, worked out, yes, we have some kind of problem that we want to solve, we then look at creating a solution for that problem. So this may be in the form of a product, a design, but generally, a good way to start off is to create a prototype, a first version of that product, something we can test out, give to people immediately to give us feedback, and then learn from the prototype that we've built and the playtesting that we've undertaken. So for example, when creating a game, we may do this. We may have an idea for a game, like for slingshotting birds, angry birds, at pigs, and we may create a prototype of that, so seeing what that gameplay or that mechanic is like. The nice thing about this is we can get it into people's hands quickly and get feedback on it and then improve from that. So with iterative design, we want to undertake a number of design loops. We don't want to just have an idea, build something, and then release it in the wild to the public and see how they react. So prototyping is the act of building something in order to test it out. I'll talk more about this today because this is the focus of the presentation. But it fits quite well with then playtesting. So we've built something, we give it to people, preferably our target users, and we get information and feedback from that. I won't go into this too much today because Anne Coppens, who's up next, is talking about playtesting. And then finally, depending on what we've learnt from undertaking a playtest with whatever prototype we've built, we can then improve it. We can also even just scrap the idea completely. And this is something that you shouldn't be afraid to do when you're creating a design, especially with a prototype. A prototype should be built quickly, tested, and you can throw it away easily. So that is the iterative design process. Generally, you'd want to undertake a number of loops. So you have an idea, build something, test it, get feedback, and do that a number of times before you actually then release a product. Okay, so let's focus more so on prototyping now. So the main thing, if there's anything that I want you to take away from today's talk, is this here. And that is that prototyping is about answering questions quickly. So we may have a number of questions when it comes to designing something. When we come up with an idea for something, whether it's a game, a gamification design, we have these questions that we want to ask and answer quickly. So these questions could be, for example, is the gamification design fun? That's an important question to ask if you're creating some kind of a gamification design, isn't it? Is it easy to learn how to play? Will people understand, for example, how to play the gamification design that we've created? Maybe we've added a leaderboard, or we're thinking of adding a leaderboard, and we want to ask, is the leaderboard easy to understand? Do people get it? Or if we've added badges, for example, are the badges challenging enough? So the first thing before we even think about creating a prototype is we need some kind of questions to ask, because a prototype is pretty much useless unless we have these questions. And these questions are basically risks within the project that we're creating. We want to mitigate as many risks as possible before delivering our final project. And by having specific questions that we can then answer with a prototype, this is key to doing that. So the first thing you do is you come up with questions that you want to ask about your prototype. And this is a great stock image. I just found it somewhere, but I think it sums up the current thoughts on gamification design quite well. But when we do create gamification, we want the best possible gamification design for our people. We don't want to invest a lot of time and a lot of money into something that doesn't work. We don't want to take that gamble. We don't want to build something, release it, and then see it spectacularly fail. And so the best way to mitigate these risks of failure and to create something that has a better chance of being successful is to create prototypes and test them as quickly and as early as possible in the design process. Ooh, okay, great. Let's talk about what a prototype, though, is exactly. Has anyone done prototyping before? Is this familiar? Oh, great. Yeah, cool. So some of this may be familiar to you, but it's good to go over the basics again. And for those who haven't done any prototyping, it's good to explore this kind of area. So a prototype is an initial model of an object or some kind of thing that we want to design for a particular solution. It's not the final product, and this is something that is important to note. A prototype is something that we make quickly in order to answer specific design questions that we have. And the good thing about a prototype is that we want to make something which is not perfect. We just want to build something very quickly we can test with people to get feedback. In fact, it's better not making a perfect prototype or something that looks like the final product, because if you are working for a client, for example, they may think the prototype is the final product. And so this can be a problem because then you might have to move forward with that. So we want to make something which is just a model. We make it quickly. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be the complete gamification design as well. It can be a very small part of the gamification design that answers the particular question that we have. So I'm going to talk about a number of different ways in which you can prototype your gamification ideas, drawing from examples from some of the work that I've done. We're going to start by looking at paper prototyping, which is a very basic and simple way to create a prototype of something, but can be really effective in terms of getting feedback. And I'm going to show you one example from a games company where it absolutely destroyed their office, this paper prototype. The second thing we're going to look at is how to create a digital prototype. So there's some useful tools and examples I'll share with you around creating a digital prototype. And then finally, we're going to go off to see the wizard, and I'm going to introduce you to the Wizard of Oz prototyping, which is a great way to quickly create something that looks realistic, but you're actually pulling all the strings from behind the scenes. Okay, so let's start with paper prototyping. The whole idea of a paper prototype is simple. You take whatever you can find at hand, whether it be paper, pens, Lego, any kind of physical objects, and you create a version of your gamification design as quickly as possible in order to get feedback. So here's an example from some of my students earlier this year. They were creating a gamified CPR test. So something that could quiz people about CPR, excuse me, and help them learn how to perform CPR correctly. So for this, they built a paper prototype in less than an hour. So they simply printed out these phone screens and drew up the prototype. And for this, they could then get people to sit down in front of the paper prototype, tap through it, and pretend to be interacting with it. And this was great to get initial feedback quite quickly. So the nice thing about paper prototyping is that it's very quick in the way that you can build something and get feedback quite quickly. So they got feedback on the interface design and whether the quiz made sense. So we could actually sit down, I could tap submit, this would come up over the top, they'd just put it over the top, and you get feedback immediately, which was quite nice. So this is paper prototyping is a very good and quick way to get feedback. It works particularly well with gamification design where you have gameplay mechanics or some kind of core gameplay that you want to test as well without having to build a digital prototype. So for example, here is an example, this is a paper prototype of a game, a gamified card game that one of my other groups of students created for distracting sick kids while they're in hospital. So they came up with an idea for an app, but they wanted to test the gameplay to see if the game mechanics were actually any fun to begin with. So rather than create the fully fledged app or create something digitally, what they did was they created a physical card game. They used their phones and calculators on the side, and they could quickly test the gameplay to see if it's any good. So this is a nice, easy way to test the gameplay for a gamified project without having to build something digital. Ah, yes, this is the one I promised you. So this is Tank Turn Tactics from Half Brick. You may know Half Brick from such games as Fruit Ninja, yep, or Jetpack Joyride. So I encourage you, I'll share the link at the end on my website, but I encourage you to read this particular article. This is it's Tank Tactics, the prototype that almost ruined Half Brick. It doesn't really look like much, does it? It's a grid with a couple of tokens on it, and that's about it. But basically, I think it was about 10 days after this was introduced into the office space at Half Brick, the game was completely banned because it pitched other people against each other. They found design flaws within the game, and it became quite aggressive and scary in the way that people were playing it. And it's quite an interesting read to see how just a paper prototype actually had such an impact on the players who were playing it. And so, obviously, we never saw Tank Turn Tactics in the light of day because it clearly had some design issues that needed to be fixed. So that's a great example of a larger company using something like a paper prototype in order to test game mechanics. So some of the tips of paper prototyping is that it's very quick and easy to make a paper prototype. You can use whatever you have, and you can get feedback quite easily. Some of the disadvantages, though, is it doesn't feel that realistic. So sitting down and tapping a paper fake screen doesn't feel like what the actual screen may feel like in the end. So if we want to create a more realistic prototype, then we can create a digital prototype. And a digital prototype is more useful in the sense that it can be a more realistic implementation of what we might be creating in the end. So paper prototypes, great if you want to test gameplay mechanics for your gamification design or interfaces, but we may create a digital prototype to get a more realistic feel. Now, the nice thing is that if we're creating game mechanics or gamification screens, there's a lot of really useful tools out there for creating digital prototypes quickly. And game engines like Unity 3D are becoming easier and easier to use. Of course, you still need to learn how to use a game engine, but these game engines are really powerful. We've seen Unity 3D, for example, be used to create Pokemon Go or Hearthstone, but this is what a lot of people are teaching at universities these days as well. And the nice thing is that they have asset stores. You can take assets very quickly and create something quite rapidly if you know how to use this tool. So game engines these days are a lot easier to use than they were in the past, and you can create things more quickly, especially if you're looking at game mechanics and testing those in your gamification design. If you don't know how to use a game engine, there are other great tools out there. InVision is one. This is a fantastic tool for basically designing a number of screens, and then you throw it into InVision, create links and hotspots between the screens, and you can sit down and watch someone use your particular design quite well. If you don't know how to use that, you can even just use something like what I'm using here today for this presentation, which is PowerPoint or Keynote. And we've used this before for testing, for example, the screens for a gamified step counter. And for this, you just simply change the screen resolution, add hotspots, and give it to someone. So we were able to mock up this game in less than a day. So the good thing about digital prototypes is that it's a much more realistic kind of a prototype of what you want to create in the end, but they can take more time, especially if you're looking at implementing gameplay. So what's the nice medium between, say, paper prototype and digital prototype? Well, for this we have to go off to see the wizard. And we're going to be talking about Wizard of Oz prototypes. So everyone has at least heard of the Wizard of Oz? Yes, maybe millennials may not have heard of it, but there's this great story. It's about Dorothy and her friends going to basically visit the all-powerful Wizard of Oz. There's a movie made. And as they go there, they're confronted by this terrifying beast, or this terrifying contraption with the Wizard of Oz, who was all-powerful and scary. But as we all know, behind the scenes, it was just one man pulling all the strings, and he wasn't really as impressive as we first thought him to be. So this is exactly the same kind of thinking behind Wizard of Oz prototyping. The idea is that you fake something, whether it's a digital prototype, and then you are behind the scenes pulling all the strings for it. So a great example is, this is one of the apps built for my PhD back in the day. It was an app to encourage learner drivers to undertake more safer driving experiences. So we added gamification to it in order to encourage them to undertake more diverse practice so they could be safer drivers ultimately. And for this, we created a nice-looking digital prototype, but we didn't want to add any networking code, for example. We just wanted to get it out and test it as quickly as possible. So for this one, we faked the leaderboard that we had in there. We just created a fake leaderboard with someone always above the person, someone always below the person, in order to try and recreate the experience of a leaderboard in order to get feedback. It also doesn't have to look pretty. So here's an example of us testing a gamified idea called Step Duel to encourage people to undertake more exercise. And for this, it was a gamified exercise chatbot is the idea that we had. But instead of creating a chatbot, people just talked to me instead. So I would pretend to be the game where they would chat to me, I would chat back to them, give them challenges, and then update their score on a very attractive leaderboard in Google Docs. But it worked. And we worked quickly. This is one of the failures, but we could build this prototype in a day, and we worked out that this core mechanic of this challenging didn't work at all. So we spent very little time in exploring that idea because we just worked out quickly from the prototype that it didn't work. Otherwise, we've created things using Squarespace, using Typeform, things that have challenged people, where they submit things through surveys, and then we update them on a website, for example, at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day. There's a whole different range of ways in which you can create Wizard of Oz prototypes. But the idea is you create something that basically encapsulates the game, but then you're behind the scenes creating or implementing all the game rules and mechanics for your gamification design. Now, obviously, there are some advantages and disadvantages. The big advantage is that it creates a more realistic game-like experience. The biggest disadvantage is that you're doing all the work of the game engine in the back. So, having to update the score and things like that. It's great for very short-term testing and prototyping and getting feedback quickly. But it's a good way in order to do it. Oh, nearly at an end now. Half an hour goes quickly. So that's basically an overview of prototyping. There's only so much we can cover in 30 minutes, but I wanted to give you an overview of some different techniques you can use. The most important thing is that to think about what your gamification idea is, to build something to test that idea quickly, and to get feedback, so then you can learn if it's good or if it needs improvement. So the 3 biggest takeaways from this presentation today. Number 1, have clear questions you want answered with a prototype. Say you want to test whether a particular game element is fun, or if the UI is easy to understand. Then make sure you have these clear questions so you can design a prototype or choose the best prototype to answer those questions. Number 2 is create the quickest prototype that can answer your questions. It doesn't have to look good. It can be made with paper. It can look terrible. You just want to be able to answer your questions as quickly as possible, so create a prototype that does that well. And finally, this one's obvious, but we can get attached to ideas, especially in the gamification design realm, where we think, yes, I must have a leaderboard, or I must have badges. But don't be afraid to scrap ideas when they don't work. It makes a lot of sense, because otherwise you'll invest a lot of time and money into things that won't work. And the great thing about prototyping is that you can get feedback quickly to work it out. That's it. So I saw some of you taking photos. If those photos don't turn out very well, you can get all the slides at this website here. So if there's one slide you should take a photo of, it's this one. But if you head to zacfitzzwalter.com/gamification Europe, all the slides for this presentation are there, as well as a number of really excellent resources that talk about prototyping, both in the game industry and also in basic design. you can sign up for a mailing list. There's a free introduction to gamification book there if any of you are still wondering what gamification is. And I hate the word special offer, but all this is, it's an announcement that I've got an online course starting January 1st. You can sign up there if you're interested in it. But otherwise, that's it. It's a very brief introduction to prototyping.
We thank you for it, Zac Fitz-Walter. Thank you.
Thanks.
I wouldn't leave you hanging out there.